Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night for you. We are in the virtual conversation with the FAN. We are talking with a lot of representatives of national archives and discussing a wide range of topics relevant to our professional community. Now is time to talk about politics of digitalization, new technologies, and old ideologies. My name is Ramón. I am the director of the National Archive in Chile. This session will consider the multifaceted dynamics, concern, experience, and ideology underpinning digitalization project and proposal facing archival institutions in the Caribbean and other post-colonial developing states. Our panelists will discuss how they have navigated the muddy waters of liberal gifts, restrictive agreements, and well as issues of rights, ownership, and access. In first place, I will present to Stanley Griffin. He is a Deputy Dean, Undergraduate Matters, Humanities, and lecturer in Archival and Information Studies in the Faculty of Humanities and Education, Department of Library and Information Studies, respectively, in the University of West Indies, Mona, Jamaica campus. Stanley holds a BA in History, a PhD in Cultural Studies with high commendation from the Cape High Barbados campus of the University of West Indies and an MSc in Archives and Records Management in the University of Dundee, Scotland. Stanley worked as an archivist for 14 years, starting as archives assistant at the West Indian Federal Archives in Cave Hill, assistant archivist in later archivist in Change, UWI Management Information Studies Program in the DLIS. Stanley's research interests include multiculturalism in Antigua and Eastern Caribbean, the cultural dynamics of intra-Caribbean migration, archives in the construct of Caribbean culture, and community archives in the Caribbean. His most recent publications include Decolonization, the Caribbean Record in an Archives Reader, is 2018, a co-edited work with Janet Bastian and John Aarons, several book chapter in journal articles on Caribbean archival and cultural issues. Stanley is active on the executive of several academic professional societies and is a member of the editorial board of the International Journal of Information, Diversity, and Inclusion. So please, Stanley, you have the word.
Thank you, Emma, and good morning, good day to everyone. Give me a second to share my screen and we will begin shortly. So, we're having a conversation this morning. We're here to talk, and my privilege is to give a theoretical baseline, an underpinning for our conversation this morning. And we want to bear in the back of our heads that we're using technologies to migrate, right? As a term of a digitization, you're migrating from one format to the next. And I want to suggest this morning that while we are migrating content, sad to say, the reality is, so very often, some of the ideologies that shaped our historical past and has influence on our present society construction are being migrated from the past into the future via the new technologies that we're using. So I want to start our conversation using Rachel Buckman's comments here, that archives have a two-face. In another presentation, I argued about archives being a two-sided coin. While it is charming in one sense, it is also harmful. And archives, based on our Caribbean experience, was very much part of the architecture of imperialism and our sources of stories, power, violence, exclusion, marginalization, and silence. And so in our regional experience, the archives became the place where the spoken word, the way we Caribbean people with our multicultural ways of knowing and sharing and recording or documenting ourselves, that was replaced by the imperialistic colonial approach, the written word. And so when we think about digitization, and we think of the records that are now considered the hallmark, the baseline of our documentary heritage, 85%, if not the full 100% of all our Caribbean archives, we consider the colonial records as that baseline. But when we look further at these records, they came out of the working of the plantation system. Or the British Mandy Banton gives a wonderful definition of the plantation as one of the earliest definitions of a colony, right? So I found that very interesting because most of our records are related to the working of plantation. And the way the plantation system worked, with its connections to the metropole, with its connections to the other parts of the empire, it established one-sided records, meaning those who wrote were the ones glorified, those who were written about were subjected. And so when we think about digitizing these one-sided records, I want us to really think about whose heritage is being preserved, whose narratives are being reinforced, and whose memory is subjugating others. A lot of our stories may have been passed down, but we have lost a lot of our stories because the structure of plantations, of plantation society, did not encourage the orality that informed our ways of sharing, ways of documenting. However, it so happened that the written word, for whatever reason, and there's lots of reasons, have survived. And so when we think of digitizing our historical records or colonial records, whose narratives are being reinforced, whose subjugation is being perpetuated. Another thing I want us to consider in our conversation this morning is this idea about who has the power to digitize. A lot of the issues, the wherewithal concerning digitization comes from outside the region. Quite frankly, in my little lifetime experience, I am yet to hear of an internal organization, a governmental initiative that will drive this need to remember and migrate to the future these records that have been, quite frankly, considered expressions of our oppression. And so heritage projects have a way of objectifying. And in objectifying, part of the reason to digitize, to migrate to the future, is this idea of protecting, the cultural objects, so to provide greater access. And in so doing, the outside so often is basically telling us in the region what we ought to be remembering and how that could be remembered. And so interestingly enough, when we think about digitization projects and the ways it will work out in organizing these projects, so very often it is about the need of the global north, the needs of the former powers seeking to, understand and safeguard, connect sources of their former spaces of governance to, this mutually complementary collections according to some of the language of these projects. It remains, however, the hegemonic authority of the former colonial powers seeking to direct how these migration projects work. And so literally, a lot of these projects are not necessarily for us. I don't have the time to go down into some of the attitudes our users have with regard to colonial records. We don't have the time for that. But at the same time, there is always this drive from the global north, the former powers, those with the financial wherewithal, the infrastructural, the technical infrastructural wherewithal, to push for these heritage initiatives in order to perpetuate access. And so the fourth point, I feel I'm leaving off some things. The fourth point is, after these digitization projects, what are we left with? Right around the region, there are lots of stories, and I'm not here to represent and call names, but we have had lots of heritage, shared heritage projects, where once the funding is over, once the Global Northern Institution has received their digitized copies and have placed these materials on their website, the regional institution is still left hanging. There is no long-term care for the original materials. There isn't even a web presence for the provision of access to these now digitized materials. And quite frankly, there is no real meeting of the two sharing parties to perpetuate that long-term interest and that long-term access. Once the investing agency has acquired their desired access, the host institution is left without much needed long-term technical support and professional direction, and therefore the on-site preservation work stops. And quite frankly, we have had lots of instances where the materials either disappear via the digitization process or deteriorate thereafter. So when we think about our conversation this morning, because we really want to talk about, how these projects work and our experiences with these projects, I want us to remember that those of us who have been written about in these records will continue to be seen as being excluded from these records, from this heritage. And so we always will have this uneasiness, this inequality, this inequity, when we're thinking about how we aim to migrate the past into the future. Most of my discussions are coming from a chapter that I've written in an upcoming work called Disputed Archival Heritage. It should be out shortly. But again, this morning, I'm hoping that my few points will help us to really think about the other side of the dynamic when we think about migration of materials via digitization and the ideologies that enforce or that are haunting some of the ways in which these projects are oriented and managed. Thank you. Chair, over to you.
Thank you. Sorry, I was writing what you say, sorry. Well, now is the place to Arjan Agema. He studied non-Western sociology at the Agricultural University in the Netherlands and worked in the field of development cooperation, culture, and museums. Since 2014, he's head of digitalization of the National Archives in the Netherlands and president of Archives Portal Europe Foundation. He is a member of the expert groups of shared archive heritage of the ICA.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you, Stanley, for your provocative thoughts on digitization. I'd like to talk with you in the same lines. As archives, we are in the midst of quite some debates in society. We have seen ourselves on the good side as keepers of information and suppliers of information, but as institutes we are also criticized. Societal debates more and more have and should have effect on archival institutions and urge them to evaluate these ideas, principles, and ways of working. As you see on the slide, next please, we are in the midst of some global discussions. Next please. We see ourselves in discussions on the displacement of archives, which is among ICA members a well-known discussion. The neutrality of archives have been challenged. We see a lot of discussion on that, not only on the institutions themselves, but of course also on the collections. We have seen a discussion on sorry, can you go back? I mean, give me the good one, please. The second slide, please. Second one. This is the first one. Yes, thank you. Within the National Archives, we organized a few years ago a symposium on rethinking the Dutch East India Company and discussions about what was called the Golden Age in the Netherlands. Are these names still applicable of an institution which was at the core of colonialization in the world? There are a lot of discussions going on diversity and inclusivity. Of course, Black Lives Matter is very fundamental discussion on that. And but I'll come a little bit later. I get back to an advice by the Council of Culture on cultural objects and whether they should be redistributed. So all these discussions lead to a need for thinking on the decolonization of the archives. Can we have, I'm not sure whether, so between June and December 2020, the National Archives in the Netherlands organized a series of roundtables on decolonization. There were about 10 tables with 43 international participants, historians, journalists, activists, and especially also representatives of communities. And these discussions were around the theme of what is decolonization and how should we, as a National Archives, act on that if we want to decolonize our collection and our institution. Very deliberately, we moderated. We had someone from outside of the National Archives to moderate these discussions, and participants of the National Archives were present with these discussions, but did not participate in the discussions themselves, to have the floor specifically to those invited to discuss this. And the meetings were both live and digital in Dutch and in English. Next slide, please. Some 16 recommendations came out of these discussions. And well, I haven't put them all there, but I'd like to mention a few of them. The Dutch National Archives always thought of themselves or presented themselves as the memory of the Netherlands. And it was made very clear by the participants that we are not the memory of the Netherlands, but that many visions and many ways of looking at our history should be represented in our collection. So there was explicitly said we need a new, much more inclusive mission statement. Another suggestion was to finance fellowships from people from the communities to do research and to make them acquainted and feel welcome to come to the National Archives to do research. Many of them feel quite a distance or quite a threshold to enter an institute, which in the end, of course, is a governmental institution. So a special action should be taken to invite researchers from those communities. We should organize a repatriation process for archives if they are requested by that. I will get back to that a little bit further on in my next slides. No, sorry, go back, please. The prioritization of the digitization of the archives, we should do in collaboration with the stakeholders. So not only practical reasons should be in the forefront, but also needs of those stakeholders in the communities. Well, of course, multilingual finding aids are a necessity for doing research, but we also should look into what we call the language and terminology of finding aids and descriptions of archives. Look whether those contain discriminatory terms, or they have descriptions of communities which are no longer found applicable. Of course, we cannot change the content of these archives, but of course we can add to the finding aids and make sure that people are somehow warned if discriminatory language is used. And well, the last one which I would like to mention is try to find a technical solution for users to add to the description. Make sure that the descriptions no longer are those of the white archivist from the past, but also from those who are mentioned within these collections, and make sure that they, in their sense, can use finding words to get access to these archives. Next, please. So like I said, in the Netherlands, we have a Council of Culture, and the minister has asked them to come up with a report with an advice on colonial heritage. This report was prepared in October 2020, and the main conclusion is put here: recognition of injustice and the willingness to rectify this injustice as much as possible. These should be the principles of the policy on colonial collections in the Dutch museums. The Netherlands must therefore be prepared and unconditionally return captured cultural goods from former Dutch colonies if the country of origin so requests. Well, that's quite a straightforward and very clear advice to the government. Up till now, it still waits for discussion in the Dutch parliament. but I think there's not much doubt about this conclusion. However, next slide, please. Archives were not considered in this advice. And the Commission said about that, in the case of archives, it is besides the documents themselves, especially the information they contain and the right to access that is important. Dealing with archives therefore calls for a specific approach which is beyond the scope of this advice. Next slide, please. For the National Archives, an advice on archives is very important. There are some archives which might be asked for by other governments, or at least we want to be prepared if such requests come to the National Archives and to the Dutch government. There are, of course, many similarities between cultural objects and archival objects. There are some stated here. They're both material and they have all kinds of values, historical, scientific, symbolic, legal, which make them quite similar with cultural objects. But there are also quite a number of differences. Next slide, please. Mainly, information is the purpose of archival objects. There's a structure in the archives, in the collections. There's a principle of provenance. There's a records continuum. So all kinds of differences make it hard to make a comparison with cultural objects if a country or a national archives does requests for bringing back those archives. So the differences, in our opinion, are the basis for doing an extra advice on archival objects by the Council of Culture. Next slide, please. So if we talk about restitution, questions come up like, to whom do we have to restitute? Is it something between governments? Is it something between national archives? Is it something which could also be returned to NGOs or to individuals? What about the structure and the completeness of an archive? Should a collection be parted? Should some parts be taken off and given to one institution or one person and other parts to another? Or should it only be partly returned? What about criteria for restoration and storage and preservation? Are there any ways to make conditions out of this, or should we just leave it for the sake of those who do the requests? And of course, what about accessibility? There are many technical issues. There are open data policies. There are political conditions which differ between countries. Should we just leave it like that, or should there be a discussion before restitution could even be considered? Next slide, please. As head of the digitization of the National Archives, I really wanted it to be that digitization could be a solution. We can deliver high quality scans, we can deliver handwritten text recognition or OCR. We can replicate the constellation of an archive in digital form by making barcoding or document classification. All kinds of web services can help to search and find modules. And of course, there's open access 24/7. But are these enough in a discussion about restitution and in a discussion about decolonizing and accessibility of these archives? And what if we thought of digitized archives as World Heritage, what would be the criteria for that, and what would be the way to preserve them and to make them and present them to the audience? Next, please. So if you look at the decolonization of archives, there are many things to consider. And of course, Stanley has already given us some really good thoughts on that. I would say be open, be transparent, be actively engaged in presenting your collection. Make finding aids and descriptions inclusive, multivocal, multi-languages, and recognizable for those whom the archives concern. Make sure those mentioned in these archives have a say in the accessibility of the documents. Proactively try to connect the researchers and to representatives of communities and ask them to help in describing the collection. And make sure that terms and terminology is non-discriminating, but recognizable and acceptable for those who the archives are about. Thank you very much for listening to me. Back to you, Emma.
I am presenting to Avril Belfon, who has been the government archivist at the National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago since 2010. She started her career in libraries, having completed her Master in Library and Information Studies at the University of Toronto in 2004, and worked at the National and Parliament Libraries. At the National Archives, she led the project for the construction of a new building to house the conservation wings and the initiative to enhance the outreach program. Ms. Belfon has served on the Executive Council of the Caribbean branch of the International Council on Archives, CARBICA, since 2010, and currently holds the position of president. She has also served in various committees, including Trinidad and Tobago's National Committee of Reparations, the UNESCO Memory of the World National Committee, and International Council of Archives, expert group on shared archive heritage. So, Avril, is yours the word.
Thank you so very much, Emma, and of course, good day to everyone, and thank you all for joining us for these discussions. I'm just checking to make sure that I can share. Oh, no, I still can't, Clarissa, so if you can share mine, that's fine. Ah, yes, here we go. So, good. So just to confirm, colleagues, you can see my screen? Yes, okay, lovely. Great. So we've had some interesting discussions so far, and thank you all, of course, before for Stanley and Arjan. I'm going to look at some very practical examples of how, just a couple examples actually, of how we have tried or how or various efforts that have been made to digitize records within the region and some challenges that we faced due to those issues. Okay. All right, so two cases I'm going to be dealing with: the reparation, an effort that we made in Trinidad and Tobago for the reparation of Spanish records. And the second case, I'm going to look at where grant funding was sourced from a private institution, well, relatively private, and so, a particular challenge that was raised there. And then the project called Megan, which I'll go a little into when I get to that slide, which was the brainchild of Carbica, which is, of course, the Caribbean branch of the International Council on Archives. And as Emma mentioned, I also wear the hat of president of Carbica. So let's talk a little bit about Trinidad and Tobago and our particular experience with trying to recover some of the records from the period when we were under Spanish rule. So Trinidad and Tobago became one nation state when they were joined, while we were under British rule. But at the time when we were under Spanish rule, it was only Trinidad. And so the island of Trinidad was ruled from 1498 to 1797 under the Spanish flag. But the only surviving records we have for that period is these, what we call the Spanish protocols. And it only ran, as is noted, towards the end of that period for a very short time. So we really have very limited records related to that period. In 2012, when we celebrated, that is Trinidad and Tobago celebrated its 50th anniversary of independence from the UK, which was our last colonial power, we were gifted by the Kingdom of Spain 14 what they called museum quality framed photographs of records held at the Archival, I hope I'm saying, General de Indias in Seville, Spain. Having received these records, I'm going to jump to that slide a little ahead of, okay, sorry. What we have here is actually an image of one of the records in the Spanish protocols. Is the index of that record that we have at the National Archives. And as you can see the condition that it is in, we also have it available on microfilm. But it is very, very fragile and it's deteriorated considerably. But here I'm speaking about the gift that we got at during our 50th anniversary. So this is an example of one of the framed photographs, and we have here the representative from Spain, our ambassador at the time, and our then Prime Minister, the Honorable Kamala Bissassa. And this was the occasion when it was handed over. My apologies for the kind of pixelated image. I got it out of the newspaper. All right, so when these photos, these records were handed over to us, we decided at that time that, you know, we should make some effort to see how much of the record, well, further get access to some of the records that are in the civil archives. Because most of, well, not most, anyone who wanted access to those records had to either go to Spain or had the information, if they even access the records online, which are, some of them are available online. A lot of our records are not available, digitized online. And of course, they are in not just Spanish, but in Old Spanish. So in 2016, we began a conversation with the Archives and Civil on how we could acquire copies of these records of significance to our nation. A priority list of records was submitted because, of course, there were lots of records, and we decided, okay, these are the most important to us, and we're going to start with these. Right. Not was advised at that time, after many, letters and emails toing and froing, that once it was reviewed, the list that we had decided on, and confirmed by the persons in civil, they would have reviewed it and looked through their collection, etc. We would then be contacted by the relevant ministry. I believe at the time it came under the responsibility of the Ministry of Education, with a cost to digitize these records. The records would then be posted on the website, their website, and then made available, and at that point, of course, it's made available to everyone. So we wrote back inquiring how, if we would receive these records because we wanted to keep these records for, well, our collection and to preserve them for long term. So we wanted the high resolution master copies. What we keep here in Trinidad and Tobago for that would be a TIFF format at a high resolution. And so that would be our preservation copy. So we wanted to know if that is what we would receive, or we were expected to get the records or just download it from the website. What this, in our opinion, amounted to was us, Trinidad and Tobago, then having to finance the digitization because we had to pay it. What we were told that we would have to pay, and then we were not sure exactly what we were going to get when we did pay for the items. Okay, so we're moving to the next slide. Okay, so correspondence continued until 2018 in this matter, up to which time we still hadn't gotten the final costing, and so we did not know exactly what would be happening with that. So we said, okay, let's try another way to get through to this thing, and we went to our Spanish embassy in Trinidad and Tobago, and we started trying correspondence through that avenue. Unfortunately, because there were several changes in representation during the period when this activity was going on, the process stalled. Ultimately, as I mentioned just now, it was unclear if that would receive the high resolution master copy as requested, and if we were expected to download the version that was available on the website, which we assume would have been a lower res a reproduction that would have been put online. Right. Good. So my next case that I wanted to highlight was the issue of grant funding that would have been received for digitization. Now, I'm putting up these three, and I'm sure there are lots all around the world, but I'm putting up these three because we in Trinidad and Tobago and across the region have had a lot of experience with these particular providers. The Digital Library of the Caribbean, DLOC, which, well, as far as we know, under the University of Florida, led that way, and it is a cooperative digital library. So people enter into agreements with the organization, with the cooperative, and then the digitization happens within the country, within the territory, and it is then put in a shared media, which is hosted, from my understanding, from the University of Florida. Then we have the British Library Endangered Archives program. The last two are both funded by Arcadia, which is why I've put Arcadia at the end there. So the British Library Endangered Archives program, which has been around in the region for some time, and a number of our colleagues have taken advantage of this opportunity. Again, it is work that is done within the country. The digitized objects are put online on the website, which belongs to the program. And there is an agreement which is signed after people are accepted to be part of the program. There's an agreement that's signed, and there are conditions for which both parties agree on, and then the project accrues. Similarly, this is new, it's newer to us. I was introduced to it a few years ago under the University of California, UCLA Library, again supported by Arcadia. That's a funding agency. It used to be called the Documenting Global Voices, and it has now been changed to Modern Endangered Archives Program. And it of course follows a similar procedure. You do apply, there's a way to apply, there's a time for applying. Once you are accepted, there is an agreement that both parties sign. And again, the digitized collection is put online in this collection on the website of the UCLA Library. In both instances, in all three instances, if I read the documentation properly, the creating agencies, the countries, they get a copy, a digital version of what is produced as part of these projects. And there are, as I say, agreements that are signed, there are conditions on both sides. And when you read the guidelines for these applications, they all sound very, very reasonable, and should, of course, lead to the countries getting opportunity to have their collection online. And in some cases, if they're in very poor condition, it is maybe the only option to save these items. Now, that is the ideal. That is how it appears. As I say, this is how it's documented. Now, I'm not going into calling the specific names of the island, but this is a particular instance that did occur. So in this island, I'm sorry, there's this thing on my screen. Right. So the island suffered damage from at least two hurricanes, what we're talking about. The archival program in the country closed indefinitely. There was insecurity about what was going to be happening with these records. So, of course, local efforts were initiated to say, what can we do? And individuals and NGOs, they all got together and decided, okay, fine, we're going to have to find a way to do this. And they approached the Endangered Archives, forgetting the name of it, the British Library Endangered Archives Program. Good, so they went through that. There were computers purchased, there was training, there was staff identified to do the scanning, and the records were digitized. Now, some years later, we had a visit to the space, and we were seeing the equipment is there, but the equipment is abandoned. The program has been discontinued. The persons who did approach for it to happen, well, of course, it was very difficult at that time even to find out that information. And we could not ascertain where the original records were, if even they still existed, and what happened to them after the project happened, and even what happened to the copy, the electronic copy that was supposed to have been presented to the country, right? So if we remember and we recall the discussion that Stanley mentioned in the beginning, this is one of the examples of, it would have started, yes, these things would have started with this intention of having these things, this digitization project happen, but there is a challenge with sustainability. And when we get into them and when we approach these projects, we cannot just look at it for the moment of it happening. I'm saying we, meaning that both sides in entering these agreements have to take the long view of how will this thing be maintained over time, being very mindful of the resources, the capacity, and the ability of the agencies making the requests to make that happen. And because at the end of the day, yes, these records are digitized and they are on someone's website, but there's still the disconnect between these records, which belong to this country, and well, the population or the people or the users of those records. They will not know at the time when we try to find out, even know where the originals are necessarily, if it is the situation, the process is not properly documented, and issues of, as I say, continuity and sustainability is not considered. Right, so I'm running out of time, sorry. Right, so the last thing now, we're looking at MEGAN, which is a project under the CABICA, the Caribbean branch of International Council on Archives. It's entitled, at the time when it was created, Memory of the Islands, a Gateway for Archival Networking. And the project was intended to create a web portal that gives access to archival resources of the Caribbean. And as you can see, the aims there is to have this common database, because as a region, much of our story is very related. And although the records may be housed in different islands, they are connected. And somebody may be looking for information about someone who may be indentured or enslaved in one island, but it would have the related records may be found on other islands. So it was always the intention that we would have this collective. Now, in light of some of the issues that Stanley raised, as well as the needs that we have identified among our members in the region, we are looking to expand this project to be what we're calling the Caribbean Digital Collective, where hopefully it will address some of those challenges that we have identified already, but it will also provide these things, the one-stop search, the related records brought together in one environment where persons can find related records easily, support for the archives that have limited resources. So it could be that if you do not have the resources to have an electronic system to store your records or to put it online, you can put directly into the MEGAN project, or if you already have items digitized, you would then just link to the site. But there will still be the opportunity for shared searching. It is, well, as part of the initial pilot project, it included training, and the software which we decided to use is multilingual. And of course, the idea of it being multivocal, so that our stories will be told in the way that we would like them to be told. So this is our vision and our hope for this Caribbean Digital Collective. So I thank you, and that's my contribution to the discussion.
Now is the place of my dear Rita, Tjien, Fooh. Rita is the director of the National Archives of Suriname since 2010 and part-time lecturer of the History Department of the Anton de Com University of Suriname. She was also the project coordinator of the repatriation of Suriname archives from the Netherlands from 2015 to 2019. She was president of the Caribbean branch of the International Council on Archives, CARBICA. From 2017 to 2018, she was chair of ICA branch's president meeting and the member of the ICA program commission, PICOM. In her capacity as president CARBICA, she was the project coordinator of the 3-year project 2016-2018 Archives at Risk, Advocacy and Capacity Building in the Caribbean, a project founded by the International Council on Archives. From 2016 to 2017, she was the president of the UNESCO Memory of the World Program of the Latin American and Caribbean region. Since January 2019, she was appointed by the Secretary General of the UNESCO as a member of International Advisory Committee of the UNESCO Memory of the World Program. She is also a member of the FAM Steering Committee representing the Latin American and Caribbean region in FAM. At the moment, she also holds the position of co-chairs of CARBICA's Caribbean Heritage Emergency Network. So, Rita, is your word.
For your introduction. So please share my presentation. Good morning or good evening to everyone, all the colleagues all over the world. So I see that there is a black, something black on my screen now. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks Stanley and Arjan for your presentation. And my presentation, the title of my presentation is Repatriation and Digitization as Tools to Decolonize Archives, New Technologies on Old Ideologies. I'm not sure if this is the correct presentation, so kindly share the correct presentation, the final one. I think this is not the final presentation. So Clarissa, if you can hear me.
And now we present for a second time to Rita. I think I don't need to present her again. Yes, so you have the word, Rita.
Okay, thank you, Emma. And thank you, Avril, for your excellent presentation. My apologies for just now when I couldn't share my presentation. The title of my presentation is Repatriation and Digitization as Tools to Decolonize Archives. You see that decolonize is quote and unquote. We will get into that. new technologies on old ideologies. So next slide. Next slide, please. So I will give a short introduction about the repatriation of Suriname's archives between 2010 and 2017. And also our experience with digitization projects. So early 20th century, colonial archives were transferred to the Netherlands for safekeeping and loan, with the explicit stipulation that the archives remain the properties of the colony, in this case Suriname. And we started with the negotiation for repatriation between 2006 and 2009. You notice that there is a long period when we negotiated about this repatriation of our archives between the Netherlands and Suriname. And finally, in 2009, we reached an agreement with the Dutch government to return the archives within 7 years. So between 2010 and 2017, more than 800 meters shelf-length archives were digitized and repatriated to Suriname. And the data, the digitized data, were also available online on our website, but through an iframe from the website of the National Archives. It was embedded on our own website. Slide 2 next. So right after the ending of our repatriation project, we signed an agreement with the National Archives of the Netherlands to specifically digitize Suriname's archival collection. And at the insistence of Suriname, also 3 bursaries were made available for master studies. And at that time, we also received an advanced scanner from the National Archives of the Netherlands to digitize the archives that were of interest of the National Archives of the Netherlands. And in our memory of understanding, it was explicitly mentioned that 50% of the time was spent to digitize the collection that were of interest of the Netherlands, and 50% of the time we had to spend to digitize our own collection that was of interest of Suriname. So a part of the digitization project with the National Archives of the Netherlands, we were also approached by the Dutch Radboud University to collaborate in a crowdsourcing project to digitize and develop a database for the slave registers. And this was done between 2017 and 2019. As a follow-up project, the Radboud University also submitted a project, and this was approved and funded by the Gerda Henkel Stichting. And the project was named Saving the Future of Suriname's History, Preserving Archival Heritage and Research Infrastructure in Suriname. And where this project is still going on. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the project to digitize the slave register, it was finalized in 2019. It was a project we've collaborated with the Radboud University, the Anton de Kom University, and also the National Archives of the Netherlands. It was a crowdsourcing project to make this register accessible. So about 1,500 volunteers in the Netherlands and a small part in Suriname, donors and other supporters participated in this project. The database of these slave registers It's also on the website of the National Archives of Suriname. But as I mentioned before, it was embedded in our website through an iframe from the Netherlands, the National Archives of the Netherlands. Next slide. Next one. Okay, what about this project, Saving the History of Suriname? The focus of this project was to preserve the population records that was in custody of the National Archives of Suriname, and it comprises of civil records, births, marriage, and death certificates, registers of endangered laborers from China, India, Indonesia, and even the British West Indies from 1830 to 1950. And due to severe neglect in the past, these records were often not accessible for researchers and the public. Next slide. Next one. So as a follow-up on the project Saving the Future of Suriname's History, at the same time, last year, the Radboud University launched a project, the Historical Database of Suriname. And this was a large citizen science project in which historians, together with volunteers, started to map, to transcribe the entire population between 1830 and 1850. And the ultimate goal is to develop a historical database of the population of Suriname between 1828 and 1950. And according to the Radboud University, the aim of this project was to gain more insight of the impact of slavery and the colonial era on the Surinamese society. Next slide. Next one. So this is an overview of this historical database. Besides the slave register, also the free inhabitants of Suriname between 1828 and 1950 is also included in this project. The information, the records of the endangered labor, the free Surinamese citizens, and data that is still missing are of the indigenous people and Maroons. So this project is still in process. Next slide. Next. So as you see before from the previous slide, after repatriation, we collaborated with the National Archives of the Netherlands and at the same time also with Radboud University in various digitization projects. And you can see we were very overwhelmed and also flooded with all these digitization projects. The turning point was in 2018 when I attended the ICA conference in Cameroon. And during one of the panel sessions, a colleague, I think it was a colleague from the African region, used the term digital imperialism to address the aggressive way how former colonizers are launching digitization projects in Africa and other parts of the world to preserve world heritage and also to provide digital access of the collection. And this session was really an eye-opener for me because it was a turning point personally for me. And I started to question all the projects we've done and still doing with our partners with the Netherlands. So when we signed our new Memory of Understanding last year, 2021, I insisted that the National Archives of Suriname must actually benefit from this collaboration with the National Archives of the Netherlands. You notice that I mentioned before that the Digitize collection were also available on our website, but through an embedded version to an iframe of the website of the National Archives. So in discussion with our counterpart from the National Archives of the Netherlands, I insisted that we develop our own website. And my request was that the National Archives also fund or finance the actual website of the National Archives, because, you know, we've been doing all this digitization project, but we were not able, because of the lack of technical infrastructure, to make this data, the digitized data, available on our own website. So after a long discussion with our counterpart of the National Archives of the Netherlands, they agreed to fund this new website. Actually, it's now in process, and I hope to launch the new website at the end of the month. Other aspect was that I insisted again on funding for young professionals with bursaries, training programs, and also research projects. You know, we also launched our own crowdsourcing project, VJVS, Find Yourself, Find Suriname, using transcribers as a tool to explore and activate multifocality in the sources. We also involve multiple agencies here in Suriname and also in the Netherlands to reveal their own story using the HTR model. And also, last but not least, we involve students and young professionals to write research papers about the archival methodologies practiced in colonial archives. Next slide. Next slide, please. So this is our old project, Find Yourself, Find Suriname. It's a public project that was set up by us. And the main goal of this pilot project is to uncover untold stories in the archives. The first theme was the indigenous and Maroon population of Suriname. We involved volunteers in this crowdsourcing project to transcribe and process the already scanned archives of the Commissariat of the Inland Population with transcribers. And you know, after the 19th century, archives were transcribed and became more readable. And the stories that were hidden in these archives became visible. And this was for us an opportunity to rewrite our history, to uncover the hidden stories in the archives. Next slide. Next. Next one. Yeah, we also collaborated with Sanami House in the Netherlands to publish Calcutta letters. What are these Calcutta letters? These are letters written between indentured laborers from India and their family in India. And we have thousands of these letters in the archive of the Agent General of Suriname. So to uncover the stories of these people, the indentured labor, it's very important to highlight all these projects initiated by community and supported by the National Archives. Next slide. Next one. Okay, another project, this is also a pilot project, is Tracing Your Roots Suriname. This is a pilot project we conducted also with the NGO from the Netherlands to also uncover untold stories of Japanese immigrants. last month, I started a pilot project with these young people to uncover these stories in the archives, and they managed to find identification card of their ancestor, former indentured labor in their archives. So the emotional, yes, the feelings these youngsters had when they saw these pictures was undescribable. The next slide. Next one. So this is my last slide. You notice all these digitization projects initiated from the Netherlands, and at the same time, this turning point from the National Archives in our way of thinking and approaching also this project. And then my question is repatriation and digitization, are they tools to, quote, decolonize, unquote, the archives? So another thing is, are Western archives, but archives from the former colonizers, able to decolonize archives using the same theoretical framework and concepts? Whose stories are going to be told? And there's a quote for Gadar. At its strongest, archival power is the power to decide what is and what is not a serious object of research, and therefore of mention of thought. That which is excluded becomes impossible to think or notice. And this is just a thought of mine, and I'm wondering if it's possible to use the same concept to decolonize the archives. As Arjan mentioned before, they also want to decolonize the archives, but who is going to decolonize who? Because these archival methods from 100 years before us, this is a kind of power, and it's the power of selection, of description, and management of the archives. Are you going to able to use the same concepts, this framework, to decolonize your archives? So that is my question. And the next one, repatriation, and this is my personal opinion based on from my own experience. Repatriation and digitization can be considered as starting points for nation states in the process to develop alternative concepts, to reveal and uncover voices that were not heard or seen before. And I don't use the term decolonize, I use detangle. We have to detangle us from the traditional policies of selection, description, and management of archives. Because if we use the old concept that is used by the former colonizers, our way of documenting our own stories, oral history, and other forms will not be documented. So these are all food for thoughts to share with you. And to conclude, you see that during the International Council on Archives conference in Cameroon, I had this turning point of my own thinking. And in my opinion, these conferences organized by ICA are very important for us, for the members, and even so for members of the Forum of National Archivists to start the discussion in a safe environment, because we have members from the African region, the Caribbean region, the Arab world, and so on, and also members, institutions representing former colonizers. So, having the discussion in a safe environment is very important, and therefore organizing this kind of panel session is also important to me, and I hope it will lead to some synergies. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Rita, for all these words and thinking. We have a few questions here. I think you already seen, but I think that anyone can answer these questions. The first is, how do you deal with issues of copyright when funding comes from outside your country or government? Do you give the donor a license on the material? For how long? Or do you share IP's rights on the digital copies? I don't know who can answer this question. Maybe Rita or Avril.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emma. Maybe I can start first. In our case, between the National Archives of the Netherlands, and I see Arjan now, the data, the archives are already accessible. These are archives dating from the 18th, the 19th century. And there are no copyrights on those data. So there are no copyright or licenses on those data. I'm not sure if Arjan want to add something.
No, I fully agree. These archives are open for anyone to research, and there are no any licenses needed to access them. So.
It is also the same for us. For the ones that we have shared, they are outside of copyright, or they belong as they are public documents, which have, so for the projects that we have started, we've selected to do those that are already out of copyright or that are public records. So we've got, if there are any issues related to copyright, I think we have one collection where the author allowed us to publish his books online. Then we are committed to making sure that persons can't download it, to secure it. And then people are advised that they need to approach the author if they want to reproduce anything that's in there for commercial or otherwise, but people can view it. Well, when we get to that, so far we would just digitize them, but we haven't put it public as yet. But the intention is that it will be that way. It will be protected online, and you will approach the author if you need to reproduce for commercial or other purposes other than research.
Okay, and the other question is similar. How engaged have your respective governments been with regard to funding any digitalization?
Well, if you look at the Dutch government, the engagement is very large. I mean, we are working on a 15-year program on digitization and the collection of the National Archives, which in total is about 140 kilometers. So we have had the assignment to do 10% of that. So in 15 years, we would like to digitize at least 14 kilometers of archives. And yes, that's a very simple assignment. But of course, like I said, also in the presentation, and it's becoming more and more a question of that, is what priorities will be sought to digitize these archives, and who are the stakeholders you want to communicate with and have a say in these prioritization. So that's our main focus at the moment. We've had a list of digitization, mainly of those archives which were asked for in the reading room the most. So we would say, well, it's very efficient. We digitize them. So a lot of people will be happy with that. But well, come to think of it now, there are also very other reasons to digitize archives. And we are trying to communicate this and look into stakeholders of these archives to come to perhaps another prioritization.
Also, if I may, Emma, I have to add now, in close relationship with the National Archives of the Netherlands, we started all this digitization project, and we've done this project in close collaboration and also with respect of our, sometimes our views varied from the other, but at the same time, Arjan is listening to what I'm saying, and I hope he's also listening to what I'm saying. And along the way, we can reach common ground to start a project. And that is something we also want to share with other with the participant and other colleagues from different national archives. We have to listen to each other, to the priorities we have, and also reach a common ground, because at the end of the day, we are all colleagues, we are all professionals, and we want the same thing, provide access to the public and and preserve this heritage for the world. And to come back to your question, with regards to funding of projects and making funds available, my government have other priorities. As you know, National Archives from the Global South, if you see, or maybe you notice it already, that governments are not making resources, financial resources available for these projects. So what we do as National Archives, we have to be very, we have to collaborate with each other, and therefore the initiative of Carbika with the Megan project, Memory of the Island Gateway for Archival Networking, is a way to combine resources, expertise, and also launch this digital memory project for the Caribbean, because our resources are very limited and our governments doesn't have the funding to fund large digitization projects. So in my opinion, Megan project is the best solution for all these small island states. So thank you. I'm not sure if Stanley wants to say something.
If I wanted to jump in about the government aspect, sorry, Stanley. Just the issue about the funding as a National Archives. In the beginning, of course, there was very, very little interest in terms of funding any activities of the archives. But from the inception of e-government and the idea of promoting electronic government, there has been an increased interest in the idea of digitization, not necessarily resourcing the archives to get it done, or staffing or equipment, anything like that, but really the idea of digitizing records so that it can be available in this new electronic environment for government to respond to e-government initiatives. So it has been like a two-edged sword. So we're getting funds to say digitize these items, but very little resources to support staffing and even the purchase of equipment to have that done. So there's an expectation, but it's really sort of unrealistic. And I have to agree with Rita. A lot of what we have to do is be creative to source funding. So that is why some of these programs, there's no choice. You really want to to use them to support the work, but you also have to be mindful to be careful of the agreements you have and how you get involved with it. And as Rita said, that we listen to each other to make sure at the end of the day we are supporting the work, supporting our public, our national public, as well as having the records accessible and available online. Yes, go ahead, Stanley.
Well, I think
Thank you, Avril. Yes, Stanley, we have a short time, so I think you have the last word here to close
okay, well,
this
thanks,
seminar.
Emma. I think our greatest challenge is one, showcasing the value, the present-day value of these historical records to our context. And that's part of I think our governments, the priorities of the governments are not necessarily about funding the historical projects. They may have more interest in funding other projects of the intangible cultural heritage, which is more of a reflection of our side of the history versus the archival documentation. I mean, here in Jamaica, you can get funding for a cultural movement, but to get digitization, you know, it's a struggle. So there's need for creativity, there's a need for understanding, and there's a need for really an appreciation of the dynamics that goes into these projects. You know, it's not a simple case of getting scanners and so forth. One thing that hasn't been discussed is this idea of a long-term preservation, server space, the training, that continued migration that happens after digitization. We're not talking about that yet, and that is an other aspect. I mean, we have had microfilming projects where after those microfilms were produced, there are no readers, right? And then the microfilms are not stored in proper conditions, and so they have deteriorated. And you know, the originals have disappeared. So you know, it's a whole list of issues that we need to consider when we think about migrating the past into the future. Thank you.
Well, so I think we are finishing this in very interesting space. So see you soon. I hope, dear colleagues, I hope you enjoy this conversation, virtual conversation. Bye-bye.